So welcome everyone. Really glad to be with you and to share some of this work, but also to open up a conversation with all of you around these topics. My hope today is to convince you of two things. In particular, that the resistance we face in the field is actually diagnostic of what's happening there, but is also diagnostic of what's happening in your own life trajectories in some ways. So doubly diagnostic in a way. And I'll do this maybe just by introducing something that I encountered when I was doing field work as an example to motivate this talk. This was when I was doing some research on the commerce of US cadavers in the United States. And I'll read from my field notes. Finally, I had secured an invitation, and I would be able to attend the meeting of clinical anatomists in New York State charged with collecting whole body donations for their medical schools. Or so I thought. Having been invited to attend by several people, I showed up that day feeling very upbeat because this was the main arena for them to discuss the challenges they faced in securing cadavers, and a topic I'd been trying to study for several years by then. Midway through the meeting, however, a member successfully put forth a motion to prevent me from attending any other meetings of theirs. Rarely had I been caught so off guard. I remember looking at other attendees, almost in shock that this person would publicly attempt such a bold move. The room grew very quiet at that moment, and the vote was cast. I still felt hopeful, but by a show of hands, I was voted out. There was an even longer awkward moment, and my memory of the rest of the meeting is a bit elusive, I will add. But the way in which the obstruction occurred was particularly stinging to me. The person wanting me out of the room asked me in fairly hyperbolic tones whether I intended to study him. Coming from an anatomist who dissects cadavers, I found the question rather ironic. Did he not himself study others? Not to mention dead ones. So my study felt very unobtrusive compared to his daily practice. Regardless, I was not able to justify and explain why I was there, and I was branded, persona non grata in this moment. This would be the first and only meeting of New York State anatomists that I ever attended. I was not escorted out, but when I look at my field notes that day, they're very sparse. And it was very hard for me to focus on anything that was said after that. It took a quick vote for the door literally to shut. At the same time, I was only beginning to learn that such obstacles offer also crucial insights for us. And I was later to discover that there was precedent for keeping people out of their physical spaces. Over the past decade, these anatomists had faced increasing pressures, you could even say competition, from new entrants, body brokers, who were securing donations and then sending them all over the US. So think of brokers installed in sunny, retiree communities, California, Florida, securing donations and sending them all over the United States. Total number of donations were fairly flat. That meant that hospitals feared losing out to these competitors. But more importantly, they feared that the brokers would cut corners. For instance, brokers would accept donations from family members versus hospitals tended to only accept donations from the deceased prior to death. That meant in practice that brokers could ask others to sign up, future deceased members, or people who had passed away to then donate them. And it would take me time to realize that preventing people from accessing physically the space of anatomists is something that they had done in the past. They had done this with body brokers. They had kept them from trespassing in New York State, and they had prevented people from accessing their offices, their hospitals, their geographies. I suspect that my presence at their meeting, consciously or not, triggered some of these dynamics. So it was completely normal for them to vote me out because they had done that in the past with others. I wish I had known this at that time, but I didn't. Of course, I blamed myself. I thought I had not prepared well enough my entry. Maybe I had not spoken to the right people. And again, I took it very personally. I'll just show you one graph to explain what was happening in their lives as I was trying to join them in this meeting. So this is my one and only network graph in my life, so pay attention. I will not do many of these. Every dot represents a hospital in New York State. The larger the dot, the more donations they receive in any given year. I'll just point out that there are, at least 5 programs that receive a lot of donations, and every arrow represents the transfer of a body to another university for them to use. So for instance, Albany has a lot of donations and would transfer to NYU, Columbia, and New York cadavers. All this preventing any brokers for physically accessing their state, because the only bodies that came from out of state came from New Jersey. So honestly, it's almost New York, right? When we're in New Jersey, and an academic program, even though legally anyone could send any kind of body to these clinical anatomists. I think what resists is often real. In this case, obstructing access echoed their desire to moralize the trade of cadavers. And my mere presence in this meeting was triggering a lot of dynamics that they had already enacted in the past. So I'd like us to refocus a bit on resistance today, but more broadly, any type of field interactivity, if we wish, rather than access. I know, doctoral students in particular, ourselves included, when we were doctoral students and still today, we dream of access. And it's important because without access, we don't do our studies. It's the holy grail. I love the way Diane Vaughan presents it by saying, it's described as the glorious moment when the gates open up and you are finally in. Another person who writes beautifully about this is Paul Rabanel. In his book on fieldwork in Morocco, he's really trying to study a village and nothing is happening. But suddenly, he gets news from the village that he can finally come in. And he spends, a lot of time buying provisions, feeling relief. His Arabic is weak. He thought he was entering a hostile situation because they didn't want him. But the real field work was finally underway. By real, also, in quotes, he's a bit cautious to kind of tell us everything is real, but that's really the big moment. And Martha Feldman and some of her co-authors maybe a bit more realistically talk about walking down a hallway with many doors. You try the doorknob, and if it doesn't open up, you move to the next, and you continue your kind of wandering march in the doorway to try to find, your field. So why are fields so difficult to access? If we think of resistance as part of what's happening, my sense is many of us could talk about this, but maybe me more than others, I've encountered different types of resistance. Clinical anatomist is what you see on your screen here on the top. I've already discussed, but there are other settings where the access was difficult. So for example, TSA, I did a study with Curtis Chan on Homeland Security and security officers, not the most obvious place to access. Harvard Business School, also, I would argue difficult to access unless you're on the faculty as I was at the time, but still not as obvious as you would think. The lower left is an example of a study with Audrey Holm and Bella Fong. So these are puppeteers at Disneyland. Disneyland is not your top research partner. They're very secretive, not extremely labor friendly in some ways. So not an obvious place to access. And finally, the middle one. So this is a study with Nick Oquito on ghostwriters of memoirs. For all of you who love Agassi, I'm sorry to let you know that he didn't write Open alone. He actually thanks his ghostwriter in the book. But all these fields have something that suggests that access will be difficult. And I'll say a bit more about this as we move forward. So when we encounter these dynamics, we become de facto interlopers, individuals who intrude into a place or situation or an activity and disrupt the status quo by examining other people's affair, even when trying to blend in. If you think you're not an interloper, I would strongly encourage you to reassess. For all of you who've been welcomed and invited in fields, that's true. But I would say very quickly you become one. I have at least two examples in mind. One is Callan Antony's work on New York banks. She was a banker herself. She has great access. Very quickly, however, she becomes suspicious, and I would argue an interloper. And another one is the study by Marc Durand on doctors in the UK military. So he was literally invited. Someone approached him telling him, we want to be studied. He goes there, spends time with them, does a beautiful ethnography. And when publication time arrives, someone contacts, an upper up in the military. That person is very ambiguous about publication, then loops back, I believe, with the dean of his school, trying to block publication, even though they had invited him. And at that point, he has to, assert that this will happen regardless, even though he had been embraced up front. So all this resistance, and resistance is basically the social mechanisms deployed by groups. These can be professions, organizations, families to maintain the status quo, is what we face in the field. It's a form of field interactivity, but there might be others. So I mentioned Embrace upfront for Marc Durand and Callan Antony. As you go about thinking about field interactions, I would encourage you to have in mind the spectrum of possibilities. Today, we're focusing on resistance, but there's a wide spectrum we can talk about. I will just pause briefly to see if there's any questions about access resistance before maybe going on to another example that might be useful. Okay, I see a quick question. So Jonas, please go for it.
Yeah, my question is a bit, you use the term interloper.
Yes.
But what I'm thinking about is a bit that there are some fields, like our own fields of management research, that have a duty to be open and to share what they are doing. So, and I feel, or I face a lot of resistance because I studied misconduct and try to report on it. Ute Hülsegger, who has a long record of also publications with misconduct, for false representation of facts, and conflicts of interests with commercial companies, and also authorships violations. And it's very difficult to publish it. And I'm actually getting a lot of retaliation, but I would not say it's an interloper, because that's the purpose of science. And there's the second case where it's really also medical. Jessica Lang, Ippolito, so my ex-wife who misused the psychiatry unit of her university to basically, yeah, misdiagnose my daughter and treat her against her will. So these are really bad cases of misconduct. My sense is that in research, it should be possible to talk about them. So I'm wondering a bit whether there are some fields. I mean, it also
Yeah.
talks about
So,
the bad status of our own field, but where you could not say it's an interloper, it's actually the duty of the field.
yeah. So a great question, but to me, the duty of openness, transparency, is completely something different from interloping in a field. So in every of these studies I will discuss, IRB kind of, encouraged me to be very open about what was happening. I usually go above and beyond what IRB asks of me, because even if they tell me it's exempt, I really want them to look at it in detail and make sure that I do everything above bar. So for those of us who do research on touchy topics in some ways, I think it's great to run it multiple times in these settings.
Yeah, but the
And for
problem,
clinical anatomists, I will show you another example, maybe from
but the problem I faced
Homeland
also
Security,
is
but for
IRB.
clinical
I think one
anatomy,
question, please, at a time.
yeah.
Yeah, I was just wanted
I will
to
just say,
respond.
so for clinical anatomy, we had at each stage a lot of transparency on what we were doing. So I had informed all these committee members beforehand of my presence, etc. I will move on to the other example, and as we continue,
Yeah, I
feel
just wanted to say
free
that
to
my
keep in
university.
mind. Yeah. To keep in mind, these potential kind of questions of disclosure and see how you can deal with them in your own context. The second example I'd like to share is an example from another field, so very different this time from clinical anatomist. And again, I'll read from my field notes and you can see what was happening. So the day Metropolitan Airport State Police briefly detained one of the students enrolled in my doctoral seminar was not the proudest moment as an educator for me. The email informing me of what was unfolding arrived early Saturday morning, meaning off hours, which is kind of problematic. And as part of the class assignment, I had asked the students to go to the airport to conduct a prearranged interview with a TSA security officer and to observe screening activities in the airport hall, if you wish. And through the exercises, my hope was that we would write memos, compare our notes, observation, and learn something from the organization. So being detained was, however, not the pitfall I had in mind when I was sending students to do this exercise. I had a very good ongoing relationship with a TSA official, let's call him Jack, and this led me to believe that observations would be a no-brainer in this context. He was my dream field contact. He had done his entire career at TSA almost, and he would answer the phone anytime something went wrong. So like really, the dream contact. But that Saturday, Hannah, the student, pseudonym, of course, warned the entire class and me that the TSA exercise was riskier than expected. I should have, of course, given Jack advance notice of what's happening, but I thought, an airport was kind of semi-public, and my misstep was unforgivable. But the detaining of a student also highlighted the core threat for TSA that was unfolding. Hannah was one of the first students to turn in her assignments. And not surprisingly, she headed to Metropolitan Airport almost immediately after reading my instructions. And she writes in her email, I went to Terminal B where I found that the screening points at each end were significantly more visible than in Terminal C. I observed for over an hour the busy US Airways gate, and at that point, however, desiring to be a good social scientist, I thought I should spend another half hour at another gate. By the way, I hadn't taught them that, so kudos to Anna for like triangulating her observations points in some ways. So she decides to go to Air Canada, much less busy, and she notes this was a tactical error. The second vantage point proved much more exposed than the first, and although she had spent a half hour plus in the first, within minutes she was spotted at Air Canada gates. Lesson 1, she writes to the class, pick a busy checkpoint. Lesson 2, if you think you've been noticed, you probably have, right? And her closing words were way smarter than mine. I expect everyone else will be cleverer than I was about avoiding detection. My only redeeming fact was that I had given them a letter on letterhead that they could show explaining the exercise, and that kind of helped her a bit. But as you'll notice, not enough. So as she was trying to observe the gate, a TSA officer approached her. She told him what she was doing. The TSA officer told her to kind of pause for a minute, immediately called state police because they have guns, TSA doesn't. And she was circled by a group of state police and TSA officers. They asked her again what she was doing. They took her driver's license. They asked her to wait while they were still circling her. And maybe 20 minutes after they deliberated her faith, they came back. By then, they'd spoken to Jack, and they told her she could continue during her observations. She ran out of the airport, never to return, warning anybody in the class that this was way more difficult than what she was imagining. But what was really critical in this instance is that TSA as a security organization, as a baseline kind of ambiguity, I would say, about being observed, because that's kind of their job, right? They're observing, so it's ironic that they would be observed. But it went way above baseline. As they were looking at her, there was something happening. TSA historically had a lot of report of travelers' theft. So people would say, my suitcase has gone through the lanes and I'm missing XYZ. And management decided that they would install cameras above the lane to try to see what was happening. And this way, if Sarah, a TSA officer is going through luggage, someone says Sarah stole something, they could pull the feed and say, no, Sarah is super clean and moral, and there's nothing going on there. One kind of implication of this was that very quickly management would notice also other stuff. For example, Sarah, your badge is the wrong way, and watch out, you should turn it around. Or I saw you, read your newspaper on the shift. That's really bad practice. Even worse, someone crossing, the gates with a wheelchair. We have protocol. The way you did it is not according to protocol. So very quickly, surveillance became coercive, not developmental, not to safeguard their employees. And TSA officers learned how to become literally invisible, or as invisible as could be in these settings. They would try not to stick out. They would not talk to their managers much. That was facilitated by the fact that they would be in new teams each time they were working at the airport. So they would be assigned to a new gate and people didn't know each other. Also, they would try not to wear, for instance, like earrings or necklaces, anything that could make them spike out from the generic kind of officers. So when Hannah was just observing from afar, again, consciously or not, I would argue she was triggering kind of a very kind of uneasy experience being seen, and officers really wanted to be invisible. That was their core desire. they didn't want us to notice them. It took us a lot of time to realize this, not in the first go. We learned it through interviews later with these officers. I recall once interviewing someone in like the quietest cafe in the airport. I picked the place because I knew it was quiet. And when she arrived, she told me like, this is the worst place for an interview. I was like, why? You know, like this seems great. And she pointed to the camera above us and she told us there are other places that would be better. And then she described to me all the other places we could go. So she had a visual map of the airport with visible or not, you know, the landscape of where you could hide or not if you wish. And we moved to a different place. Another instance when this came up was a moment we had been told, you know, we have good access, but we should not observe when officers pick their shifts. They would line up by seniority and be given the opportunity to pick their shifts. On this project, there was Curtis Chan, myself, and Anteby, a research assistant. One day, she came back from the airport really in panic, and she told me, you know, I was there. Suddenly, people started to line up, and then I realized that what I was seeing was this moment I'd been told not to watch. So we tried to debrief, but what we found awkward is that we had internalized the taboo against seeing others or seeing things we shouldn't. And as researchers, honestly, it makes little sense. You know, why should we be so concerned? At that moment, with other data points, slowly we began to realize that visibility was really something we should be concerned about. And we discovered it like day 0 of the study. Remember, like when Hannah comes in, she's seen and she's picked out. So that's another example of what I'm trying to focus your attention on. Field reactivity, here resistance being very diagnostic of what's happening in the field. I want to share another example, but I'd like to see if there are other people who might have reactions or questions before we continue kind of this explorations of these dynamics. So feel free to step in if you have a question or anything you'd like us to talk about that has not yet been raised. And I'd like to take maybe others, if you don't mind, Jonas, to make sure everybody has enough space to ask their questions. Yeah, sure. Ash, please. If I pronounce your name correctly, go for it.
Yes, thank you, Michel. I'm really resonating with a lot of the things that you're saying because that's my experience. First, I was an urban planner, so we'd go into these neighborhoods and go on roofs, and people would panic. But also in my qualitative work now in management, my question is really related to the last point that you said. When you witness something that you're supposedly not supposed to witness, what do you do with this data? Because this happens with me is like sometimes I forget my recorder somewhere and I'm having a conversation and then I go back and I find a very personal interaction that happened. And sometimes it's just revealing for me as an ethnographer, but I tend not to put it in my qualitative findings
Hmm.
but how do you deal with that?
I mean, you know, uh, to me, what's interesting is to also reflect on why you've been told not to look at this in part. So it's not the data itself is not that interesting than trying to figure out like what's the dynamic behind this. uh, as ethnographers or even interviewers, we all know that like the end of the interview, you know, when everything has been done and said, and we say, is there anything else you want to add? Like that's the best moment in some ways. And it's still on the record. If there are clear obligations, and this goes back to IRB requirements not to do stuff, unfortunately, you have to pull it from the data. And there are, you know, I have data I'd love to use, but I've never been able to exploit. But at least they inform my understanding of the field, even if I don't share them. So I encourage you to think of what other patterns you might have in your data that would talk to that dynamic, Ash, if you can. And see Tuo has her hand up as well. Go for it.
Hi, Michelle.
Hi.
I have a question regarding like the resistance. Would building rapport gradually and gaining trust of the informants, and also like maybe upfront have more open communication with the people you're going to study. So we have like built this expected expectation, like we manage the expectation mutually. Would that help to reduce the resistance?
So I would say it depends on the type of field work you're doing, because I'm not sure reducing the resistance is the goal, right? You learn a lot from resistance. So building rapport is what we all do, and it can lead, even though you have rapport, to resistance on certain interactions or certain types of data points, like I mentioned. So to me, these are two different kind of dynamics happening. Without rapport, it's really hard to do any field work, as you probably have already discovered. And it's kind of a walking around the rapport and trying to test the boundaries, probably as you do it, to make sure that you have access to as much data you can. What setting are you studying?
Right now it's more the virtual online because I'm studying the influencers. So
yeah, so the question is like, when would they unfriend you or drop you from their kind of social circles? And that's an interesting one to explore also.
Okay.
I see Esther also wants to step in. Go for it.
Thank you, Michael. In my ethnography research on the implementation of voluntary carbon markets in indigenous communities in Oaxaca, here in Mexico, I have encountered subtle forms of resistance, not over protest, but rather skepticism, disengagement, and selective participation.
Yes.
And I'm asking about how would you suggest conceptualizing these forms of resistance within broader institutional dynamics in my work. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Esther. You know what I love when only some people are willing to talk to you is to try to figure out what categories of participants are the ones who are willing to reach out, and by contrast, why some others might not. So if there are various kind of geographies of protest or various levels of professionalization within the activism movement, trying to figure out who is telling you what by refusing to talk to you is, I think, extremely important. In hospitals, you would track, nurses versus physicians, or one service versus another. I have this example in mind, a French sociologist who was doing studies in psychiatric wards in Paris. One ward was very drug kind of focused, so they would give mainly drugs to their patients, and another one was very psychoanalytical in inspiration. She got great access to the drug ward, but was kind of almost barred from access to the other one. And part of the reason she reflects on when she writes about this is that maybe they saw her as too close to them, like doing the same thing, right? Versus those using drugs would clearly see their jurisdiction as being very different to hers. So all this is great data in some ways. I'll take maybe two more questions and then continue so that we can have a bit longer conversation. So I saw Menno had a question, and Ravi. Menno, please. Yeah.
Oh, yes. Thank you. Thank you, Michel. Thank you for the presentation. I will just follow up with the question Ash just asked about when you inadvertently record something, but it is not the same way. But in my case, how do you deal with data when your respondents say that it is a confidence and I don't want you to use that in your report or in your research? but I know that you're recording, but I will still tell you this, but I don't want you to use that. How do you deal with this type of information? Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks. I mean, first, the fact that they're telling you that is a good sign, right? It means they trust you. So that's a wonderful indication of the quality of your rapport with them. At the same time, you have to completely respect, their wish, because if you don't do so, you might burn yourself in any subsequent field work. So always, be on, respect your word. There's another study I love. I can't remember the author, but this is in New York. He was doing interviews with, I believe, male prostitutes, and had told them that, he just wanted to talk to them, and would never pay anyone. And in a few instances, some people tried to get him to pay for stuff that they needed. He always refused, because he knew that if he wasn't following his own word would spread that he was not trustworthy. He had paid for something for one, but not for others. So it was really important for him to be consistent. And if you want them to tell you again things in the future, unfortunately, you have to follow everything they tell you at this point. I will share maybe another example that might give you a sense of these forms of resistance, and then we'll continue the conversation and transition also a bit to the self-diagnostic piece. So the second example I'd love to share with you is from my dissertation. So it goes back a bit, but still, was informative. These are field notes from my dissertation. It was in a factory called SNECMA in France. The factory produced engines for military and civilian planes. If you've been on any kind of Airbus or Boeing, you probably had one of these engines on your airplane. But the truth was that I was getting nowhere in my dissertation. Several days per week for more than a month, I had been coming to this French aircraft site because I was hoping to study it. And yet, after all these weeks, I had still not landed any interview. Days had gone by with the only highlight of my field visit being the train ride from Paris to the nearby commuter rail station. I would then borrow my mother-in-law's car parked in that station, and she was doing a reverse commute, and drive to the plant. So it was kind of long, and absolutely nothing was happening. Despite repeated exchanges with my key contact, her name was Jeannette, she was the communication director of the Labor Council, my only interview after a month had been with her. So nothing else had happened. The famous snowball sampling never happened. And I was really hitting a wall, and I was afraid that my funding would roll out and that I could not continue because I didn't have a plan B. One day, however, Alain, a retired craftsman, walked into the plant labor council. And by then, Jeannette was ever eager to get rid of me or help me, I'm not sure. So anybody walking in, she would speak to them, trying to, arrange for an interview. As this was happening, Alain decided that he would show me a museum nearby. This was a small shack. I had visited it. Honestly, there was nothing much to see. But by then, of course, you say yes, right? If someone wants to talk to you, you run with it. So he offered to show me the shack. And because I had spent a month doing nothing, I was very aware of every engine produced at the plant. I knew the archives in and out. You could show me an engine. I could tell you, what year and what name. And I was super attuned to their line of products. So he brings me to this engine he's working on. immediately I noticed it's an engine that was built in the 70s with General Electric, one of their key partners. And it wasn't a random kind of engine, but it was really an engine that generated half of their revenues, a really important product in their lineup. He spoke about it for at least 20 minutes. And at that point, I asked him if he had ever seen American engineers at the plant. I knew this because my father-in-law, who was at the lower rank in the plant, had spoken, repeatedly about American engineers coming over, and even people going to Seattle to work with the Americans. He brushed away my question as if I was asking, about a really strange kind of occurrence at the plant, and continued talking about the engine itself. At that moment, I asked him if he had ever been to the US. I knew a lot of them had gone, and he seemed at the rank where he would have been sent there at least to help at some point. Brushed it off as if nothing had ever happened. So his blind spot created these uneasy interruptions in our conversation. And I would go back to the technicalities of the engine, but in my field notes, I have all these notes trying to highlight the puzzled reaction that he might have with these questions. And that's when I suspected that my own affiliation, I was then a doctoral student at NYU, might carry more weight or problems than I imagined. By then, I had also secured an affiliation with a French university, and I would present myself as being associated with both. But I tried the next time around to just say I was associated with this French university. And when Jeanette tried to encourage others to speak to me, again, I told her, maybe you want to just say I'm part of this university in France. Suddenly, the snowball sample completely went exponential. The interviews that had never happened, were coming in repeatedly and day after day. And that's when I, again, realized there's something going on here that might be a bit more complicated than I thought. In this instance, there was kind of this thing of forgetting foreign collaboration, but also something about upholding the French patriotic image of the plant. After World War II, General de Gaulle had asked SNECMA to create engines that would allow the French military to kind of win the war this time around. And they were really proud of their productions. So the fact that Americans were working with them on an engine was not okay, I would say, per de Gaulle's kind of standard. I noticed this dynamic in a very different moment as well. So I used to send out letters to the address of retirees, asking them if they wanted to talk to me. The Labor Council had facilitated that access. And as I was doing this, once I received a letter back, the widow wrote that her husband had passed away, and unfortunately, I couldn't talk to him. But I did know maybe I should talk to her. So I almost threw the letter away, yet kept it, went to see her. We talked for a long time. At one point during our conversation, she told me when the plant was down south, no one had ever spoken about the plant being down south. I'd always seen the plant where I visited it. But I noticed that as I probed her, she told me that after World War II, German and Austrian engineers had joined the plant. They had worked for the Nazi regime, had been given immunity from any prosecution if they worked for France. And that was a moment where they allowed the French kind of military to reach its patriotic duty by building, good engines and planes. So there was a moment in the history of the plant where the foreign collaboration was very embarrassing, right after World War II, and again in the 70s with the Americans. And I was just walking into this plant as an American doctoral student, not realizing, for sure what was happening. But these moments kind of taught me in part that there was a real dynamic around resistance to these collaborations, and they were trying to remember constantly to forget what was happening. So this is another example of the type of resistance that I want us to keep in mind. The book project that Sarah pointed out up front has different chapters. The 3 we've discussed today, but also 3 others in different kind of settings. And as we think about this, every resistance has a different flavor because something different is happening in the field. So that's why I believe resistance is very diagnostic in many instances of what might be happening. I want to transition in my last part that will be a bit shorter on what we can learn also about ourselves as we do this, but want to make sure that the flavors and variety of resistance are something that you have in mind and that you might have examples from your own field. So again, I'll open for a few seconds, trying to get new people in the conversation. If you've had any form of resistance or have questions, please go for it. Yes, Jeanne, am I correct? Or Jean?
Yes, Jeanne.
Jeanne,
Hello.
okay, please go for it.
Thank you so much. This is super interesting. Yeah, me, I have one case, and I wanted to ask you. I hope it's general enough so that everyone can understand. So, I've been able to arrange an interview with someone,
yeah.
and that person, right when we started, she said, "Oh, by the way, I only agreed to talk to you if we just talk about ABC topic," which I wasn't really interested in, to be honest. And I refused to talk about the other topic, which I didn't even know was touchy. So that was also very interesting for me. So, of course, I went into her direction, right? We took advantage of the time and we talked about what she wanted to talk about. I tried to make it useful for me, but not to push her. And then I was fortunate enough because I had an interview with her colleague who had since then left the organization. So I was kind of able to understand what was the tension, although I didn't know it was such a big deal. But now I'm pretty sure that one interview I had with her colleague is the only interview I will ever get on that topic. So I'm wondering also for data richness and so, because I sense there is something interesting there, but besides one interview and some field notes, although I'm not doing ethnography, so I can really just talk about what I saw during an interview, right? Which on top of this was online. So, I wanted to ask you, should I try to kind of get more information on it? But how do I do? Because I feel it's a sensitive topic for her and for the organization. Actually, I suspect her boss to have asked her not to talk about this. I really don't want to put my, to
jeopardize your access.
For example, yes, and to make people uncomfortable, which I think is terrible. But yeah, so yeah, I don't know if you have any advice on
So
that.
I do think, first it's wonderful. So insiders, outsiders are the best, right? People who know a lot but are not fully embedded. So people who've retired, people who've left, spouses of people who work there, like anybody who's in that position is a great informant, partners or people who know a lot about their lives. And you'll notice that often access is facilitated by these kind of ambiguous characters in the field. You just don't know yet that they're ambiguous, right?
Right.
So I would say run with more of those. If you can get a list of former employees, maybe by going on LinkedIn and doing searches, that would be a way to kind of build your sample. And even though you want to respect their desire not to talk about something, the fact that it's so obvious and it seems to be the elephant in the room seems to me like a great opportunity to run with some of these dynamics.
Yeah.
Because they will be interested as well, right? If it's so touchy, it means something for them.
And do you think, sorry, just quick follow-up question. Do you think that I should just offer her to talk without a recorder, just to?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Mm.
A bit, like Menno, I think, had said, if she wants to talk about something off the record, that's fine.
Mm.
and then you'll figure out a way to kind of get the
Yeah.
data that you need. Yeah.
Thank you, very useful.
And I think Mohamed maybe might want to step in.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. As you keep talking, I think what you've been describing really resonates with my fieldwork in Nairobi, in Kenya. I faced a lot of resistance, and I think there are different origins of why I faced that resistance. So I was trying to make sense of it. So without like giving so much details about the field and what I'm doing, my question is mostly directed: to what extent do you think that these techniques or strategies or ways to look at resistance as a pathway to something interesting transfer to other qualitative research traditions? Because I don't do ethnography, and maybe in the examples that you draw on, it's really heavy descriptions of the field, heavy field notes, participant observations. Sometimes I don't have the luxury to have that depth, and I just interact with people. Like I do multiple case study research in the Eisenhower tradition. So I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on the transferability of field resistance to other qualitative research schools?
Yeah, so I do think it translates, but maybe at different moments. So for instance, one of my colleagues does surveys, and she recently was able to insert a question, which I love, for those who do not want to take the survey. So it's an open-ended, like a few sentence question, like, could you tell us, why you didn't take it? So that's a design that allows her to capture some of this pushback. I do believe when you do case studies, the initial meetings are very important, and every data you can get when they're guiding you to what they think is important, which speaks a bit to Jean's point. They're also keeping you away from what they don't think is not important, but they don't think you should focus on, right? So those moments of like being, like when you're in a pinball machine and the ball goes somewhere, like the trajectory is really helpful to explain what's happening. You could write up in your method section how you landed on the case selections and the topics based on their, pushback and embrace. And I would hope that this gives you insight on what's happening in the fields as well.
Thank you.
Yes, Ravi.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, I already put it in the chat.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not monitoring
No,
the
that's
chat.
okay. I think there is some responsibility on the part of the seeker of the information. You touched on it already. It's really trust, and this is taught in journalism courses, and expert journalists try to engender trust in the respondent. And one way to do that is as a generalized precept. It is, instead of asking for absolute measures, ask for relative measures. And the example I gave in the chat is, I worked in venture capital industry for a long time.
Yeah.
And there is interim valuation before a company goes public, where information is very confidential. You can't just ask them, what's your business valuation during that private placement stage? So instead of asking for an absolute number, ask for, put the question in relative terms. Are you above the industry average? Are you below the industry average? So you're not really seeking specifics, but you're asking a relative measure, which could be methodologically as useful in your research as the absolute measure. So from absolutes to relative, that's the point I wanted to make.
And you doesn't talk without breaching what they have to do internally for themselves. I think Amin is also trying to ask for a question.
Yes,
feel free to step in.
Yes, thank you very much, Michel. I was not able to attend all the your presentation. I just came back at the end, but I will. I'm just a PhD student, a pre-comps PhD student, but I'm a former entrepreneur. I'm going to do as well autoethnography. And when we talk about trust, it is what I have seen in I believe when we talk about trust, you have, first of all, when we talk about ethnography, it is my belief, okay? It is about people, not about the name of the company. Sometimes, you know, you can have, if you've got a bad experience, you will say these companies do that. But inside the company, it's depend with the people we're gonna interview, you know? You know what I mean? For me, it is all about the people. It's not about the title or their rank, first. And secondly, what I believe the trust, even me, when I'm trying to build relationship, is depend what we're talking about. But together trust is funny. So what is the metrics? 80%, 70%? For me, I believe as a former entrepreneur, the entrepreneur, they will understand what, I'll give you an example, okay? I'm having an engineering background, okay? Now I'm transitioning to academia. I was working in the airports, and as a project manager, so I developed and I contributed to the development of the project and sell it, you know, in different airports and sometimes via agent. And when I talk with the people from the bottom in the hierarchy, or different kind of bottom people, they will know exactly if you are an engineer selling something or you are only a salesperson, you know. And when the salespeople left, they say that it is a few, they start. So I'm trying to say, to get trust with the people in front of you in the interview, if you are not belong to them, you are not able to understand them, you know. And for me, everything it is about that. It depends what field we're doing with. I'm not generalizing, okay? But if we talk about entrepreneurship, it will be something like that. But if we're talking about humanities, it is what you're doing about medicine or whatever, it will be different. I believe all it is about people and our experience. It is my believing. Maybe I'm wrong. Huh? Thank you.
No, I think this is a wonderful point to bring out, and you know, completely timely in some ways, because I wanted to transition a bit, and if you don't mind, Carrie, I'll keep your questions for a bit later, to the last part about why resistance or field reactivity is also diagnostic about ourselves. In a way, we've spoken about what we learn from these moments. And Amin gave us an example of, you know, when they know you're an engineer, they might talk to you differently. So we're not here aiming for objective data collection. You know, it's your presence in the field that creates the data and what you bring, your trajectory specifically. So that's why the interactivity is also diagnostic about your background, trajectory in life. I think there are unique affinities between what we study and our trajectory. And we're an embodied scholar in a field, whether we do ethnographies or interviews or other kind of forms of observation, you know, video observations as well. And it crowns probably a journey that's partly already taken. So we're not starting from scratch each time we enter a field. Brooke Harrington talks about some psychological regularities that she sees between researchers and their fields, and that come up over time. Steve Barley has a very nice small piece or chapter called Puddle Jumping as a Career. So going from a puddle to another and hopefully creating a stream or a river, right? But as we're doing it, we don't know. We just know that we're doing one puddle and the next and continuing. I'd like to share a teeny bit about my journey and why resistance is something I'm very familiar with. But I also understand that it's not comfortable for us to always do. In particular, if you've been trained more at the, you know, mezzo, macro kind of sociological level, bringing in the individual is not what we usually tend to encourage in some ways. As an example, Marion Fourcade, who's a sociologist, wrote a small entry about her education in a book that was edited recently by David Stark. It's called Practicing Sociology. And she tries to talk about this uncomfortable position of the individual relation to their work. She says it's uncomfortable, and sociologists of all people should be suspicious of the explanatory value of introspection. She then goes on to explain, it's an honor to write this entry because the purpose of the exercise is to make my scholarly life and trajectory relevant to others, implicitly also to her research. But it remains uneasy to navigate, she adds. Sociological honesty requires one to try at minimum to avoid two common mistakes. The error of seeing one's life as a sequence of purposeful choices, but also the error of seeing a succession of random events in one's life. So if we reflect on Amin's comment, I'm an entrepreneur and therefore I can talk to them, and that allows me to do my research. So that's the sequence of purposeful choices. But at the same time, we have to allow for kind of randomness when we do our field work. I want to focus a bit on the purposeful sequence of events and explain why, in my case, resistance was something I was comfortable with. Growing up as a gay youth in a not extremely conservative religious context, but a religious family, I gained very quickly fluency in juggling all kinds of defense mechanisms. So think about denials, hiding, silencing. All this happened within my family when I was growing up. And I want also to emphasize that it's not just identities, but unique journeys that kind of make us. So within my family, there was, as my aunt used to say, prior events. She would tell me that it runs in the family. And the way I grew up, above and beyond what anyone would expect in these contexts, was unique and formative. So I'll give an example. When I was younger, one of my cousins divorced. His ex-wife remarried, and the cousin, the ex-wife, and the kids of this cousin and ex-wife would all go on holiday together. Maybe very normal in some settings, but kind of slightly off. I wasn't sure why or how this happened. And over time, my cousin came out and told me he was gay. So that kind of explained why maybe the trio kind of vacationing was a perfectly normal setup for their holidays. In another instance on another side of my family, there were 3 siblings, 2 sisters and a brother. And when we would visit that family, the brother was conveniently always absent. I later learned that as a youth, the story goes he had been molested by a male coach. I'm not sure about the details, to be honest. But what was very clear is that anytime we would visit, the person was hidden out of sight. So in my own trajectory, if you wish, there were multi-generational dynamics that explained some of the defense and resistance mechanisms. But also one could argue, the familiarity, or at least like skill sets that I developed. I'm not sure, you call them strengths, but something that allowed me to be perfectly comfortable with resistance. If someone tells me, this is something you should not see, or denies to my face something that I know happened, I'm really good at just absorbing it and not being upset and trying to find another way to kind of get to that information. I encourage you to think of what in your journeys allow you to do what you do, and also allow you to interact in the ways you want with your field. A colleague of mine, for example, who is Mormon, even though she's no longer part of the faith, studies men in powerful positions. And as I was talking to her about field reactivity, told me that she's actually very comfortable talking about men in powerful positions because that's what she grew up in when she was young in her family as well. And her entire research is on that, and she's really good at making those people feel very comfortable in their powerful positions in some ways. So I'd like to, kind of conclude in some ways that we carry the seeds of what the interactions will be in our fields. When fields react to us, it's not only because what's happening with the field participants, but it's also because they're adopting us and exhibiting patterns that we're good at picking up on or dealing with. So resistance in many ways is also diagnostic about ourselves. To conclude, keep in mind that resistance, but any form of field reactivity is doubly diagnostic, what's happening in the fields and ourselves. And even though I faced hurdles, and I encourage you to pause and not complain, but kind of analyze the hurdles you faced in your field, I would argue it's also true for other forms of reactivity. So for example, field embrace is suspicious to me. If like people bring you in a bit too rapidly and want you absolutely to study them or become them. A wonderful example of this is a book by Kathleen Blee called Women of the Ku Klux Klan. She did a study in the Midwest, I believe, of women who had belonged to the Ku Klux Klan, and she had lists of cities where membership was really high. She went door to door. She's a white Caucasian woman. What surprised her is that people would say, oh, sure, please come in, honey. I'll give you some coffee and we'll have tea. And she really wasn't expecting that. She was expecting, stigmatized behaviors where people would deny that they'd ever been part of the Klan. But because they had been in towns where everybody was part of it and the norm was that you would embrace, they were also just exhibiting what they knew how to do best. And she was embraced in the field. Suspiciously embraced, maybe one would say. So I hope that this invites all of you and other derailed field workers to pause when you think you're failing and to reflect on what this might be. I'll share a last quote, maybe from a syllabus that Michael Burraway shared with his students in '94 on participant observation. Michael just passed away, and he was like one of the greatest field workers one can imagine. He tells us that our social theory is designed to explain the behavior of others, but reflects back on ourselves as well, who we are and what interests we have. And when we enter the field, it's aggravating, it's humiliating sometimes, but it's also the most significant because we provoke crisis and reveal what is normal or taken for granted. So barriers to entry display the values, assumption, and also interest of those you are about to study. I will turn it over to the room for questions, but if you're interested in more, I encourage you to open the book and try to think of the ways you can leverage field reactivity in your own research. I will stop sharing and open up if anyone who hasn't yet spoken maybe wants to share. I did not track who was first, so I apologize.
I think I was there quite early.
Okay, go for it, please, Carrie.
Yeah, thanks very much for this presentation. I think it was super interesting. And I was thinking, actually, I didn't know about your book. So I was thinking this could be a piece of research in itself, right? But you have already written a book on this. So yeah, that's very interesting. But I think there is one big elephant in the room if we have this access issue as the topic, because I'm talking from the viewpoint of a business researcher, business studies researcher. It seems to me that there is these days a gigantic obstacle to do any kind of, let's say, in-depth case study type of research with business firms, especially if they are listed firms. And it's quite often I have faced these difficulties, and my students have faced these difficulties. And quite often it is so that some people would like to do this. They would like to be involved in a piece of research and even a longer term collaboration. But then comes the big obstacle, which is that these bigger firms, especially listed firms, most typically, they have a policy of not giving any accesses. And they ground it because of business secrets. And then they say, normally the process is yes, first is yes, yeah, we won't, but let's check with the lawyers. And then the army of lawyers say no, or they make it so completely difficult that you can't do it. And now what we see in journals these days is an outcome. In really many cases in my field, which is accounting management, accounting research, we see empirical materials from NGOs or governmental organizations, or if they are empirical qual, they are interviews. So you can do cross-sectional interviews. That's good. But over and above that, you normally just can't get access. And this has become much more typical these days, I think. And I would just like to hear your views and other people's views on this.
So, I think you're right, and it's always hard to do this. I've always signed NDAs with organizations, allowing them to disclose themselves if they want to, usually. So that kind of lowers the bar to entry because, they won't be identified in some instances, at least. What I also ask and offer is a first read. So they cannot object to publication, but I give them a window to comment, like 30 days where I share a draft. I also, put the timeline because if not, it's open-ended, where they can provide comments that I can or not integrate. And then when this doesn't work, there are a lot of ways to access organizations indirectly. We mentioned, former employees, I think, speaking to Jeanne. There are professional associations. I was talking to someone who is fairly senior in our profession, and he's telling me it's the first time ever he's doing a study with an organization. Even though as I was reading his paper, I thought he had, but I reread, and actually no, he's always spoken to individuals in individual capacities. So the problem is that your sampling is more difficult because you have to go after people one by one, so you don't have a full list, but at least you do not need sign off from their employers in some ways. So I hope that we, embrace all the possibilities to do organizational research with and without organizations, and also give them the benefit of non-disclosure if that's what they prefer.
Yeah, I've done all that, but then exactly as I said, if the firm says no, then it's no anyway. So NDAs, of course, and so forth. It seems to be an increasing problem. That's my worry.
I hear you, and if others have better solutions, or feel free to share. Let's take Virginie, and then if others have other ideas, feel free to step in again.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation and for bringing this topic that we all face, I guess, when doing fieldwork. And I would like to know if you have some tips to brace or prepare for resistance, because I am to do some data collection soon, and the organization that I will be approaching is used to interviews with journalists. So there might be some resistance regarding this. So would you have some tips on how we can prepare and anticipate, because there are resistance we can anticipate. So how to, deal with that?
Yeah. So one thing I try to do, and this was brought up when we mentioned different population, is when I have a sample of people to interview, I'll start with the lower ranks, because I want to make sure that the higher I go in the hierarchy, the more data I have, so I can signal that I understand what's happening. Usually the higher up you get, the more polished the discourse, and you really want to derail this, right? I'll just share one example, but the clinical anatomist I had interviewed always talked about the integrity of cadavers, and that was important. And they would tell me, independent ventures do not respect the integrity of cadavers. In the process, I also learned, and I apologize for the details, but that cadavers were used by multiple users. So for instance, surgeons wanted a torso, dentists wanted a jaw, someone was working on an articulation. And in a few instances, medical students, wanted the ear, but it was unclear if the ear was returned to the program for cremation, because the integrity of the body was a bit fuzzy, right? And it's good for you to kind of equip yourself with the details of their field. So when they talk about something, you can slightly derail by inserting examples that force them to realize that you actually know a lot about what they do, and that the polished discourse will not be the only way around. So knowledge, I guess, is the answer, and building it slowly as you go up.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Michel, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I think we have a couple more questions. I know Ash raised his hand, but I believe Christina on the chat also had a question. Christina, do you want to come on camera to ask your question?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, my question is about how to approach communities. I'm working with entrepreneurial communities, and some of them are indigenous. So there is a cultural barrier and sometimes a language also. And they are so cautious that the information that they're sharing could be used in not ethical ways, I guess.
Yeah.
So in time, I gain their trust. They know me for some years now, but it took a really long time to gain access and to the people and do my interview. So I'd like to know if you have some suggestions on how maybe we can shorten that time and show us more approachable, maybe, because at the beginning I describe what was my research, and also that the information was going to be used specifically for the research purposes. No, so I don't know if you maybe have some suggestions on that matter.
I'm sorry to break the news, but I don't think we can shorten it in some ways. The fact that they're sticking with you is a great sign, again, of the quality of your research. What I've always done, however, is try to enroll at least one person from the field to read a draft, right? So that's a way, regardless of my published papers, I think in each site I had one insider who was willing to read and tell me if it represented kind of the way they thought about their field. So it creates like an extra partnership. And if that person talks about it to others, that's fine. It will give you credibility over time. I want to be cautious of everyone's time. So I see maybe Ibrat, as the originator of all this, if you want to go with the last reaction or question. It doesn't have to be a question, so feel free to share any insights you have.
It's a question. Thank you, Michel. I was curious. I mean, I love your talk, and I heard it before, and I really liked it. But I was curious, since you experience a lot of resistance, but you nonetheless try to collect data, how does it shape your interpretive process of, how you interpret the data? What you're paying attention to? Does it shape somehow your interpretive frame in the way what you then look for in the data and what you try to conceptualize?
So I will say it shapes my interests. I'm not sure if it shapes the frame, but it shapes the puzzle towards which I veer towards. I'll give you an example from TSA. So Curtis Chan and I were doing the study together with Anteby, as I mentioned. So we had access to the exact same data, right? We were sharing memos, reading interviews, exactly the same thing. And I was slowly discovering that visibility was an issue for them. Curtis kind of joined when I talked to him about this, but that's not what he was picking up on. As he was reading through the data, he was looking at gender discrimination dynamics, in particular that women were not staying at TSA. The reason being that they were asked to do pat downs, and because there were less women and the pat down had to be matched by gender, they ended up doing pat downs all day, and that's something they really hated. Not only they, but everybody hated doing pat downs, right? So there was an issue of retention that could be explained by the fact that one job, an officer, had two very different tasks, even though they had the same label, and that explained the imbalance within their retention and turnover rates. The fact that Curtis, navigated towards that puzzle, we would have to ask him why. But it just tells me that anybody thrown into a field will probably end up on something different. So replicability is not our goal here. If you, Ibrat, you enter a field, I expect you'll find something that I would not because of who you are and your trajectory. And I think that's great. We should embrace it. If there are enough field researchers that blanket organizations and professions, we'll end up finding a lot, right? So encourage your subjectivity in the field, whether you have uniquenesses or trajectories that give you access to something, that's great. And I hope to see and read many different cuts on the same data.